Syrian Americans in World War I, as this spring marks the 100th anniversary of the entry of the United States into the war. So we have a lot of materials from our collection that deal with Syrian Americans and other Americans of Arab ancestry in World War I. Today we're going to be looking mostly at things from a collection known as the Evelyn Shacker collection. Evelyn Shacker was a historian and a writer and a community activist based in Boston. So a lot of the pieces we have today are from the early Boston Syrian American community. The first item is very early in the run-up to the war. The United States was raising money mostly by having people purchase Liberty bonds, Liberty loans they were also called. And this is just a letter to the Syrian American Club of Boston from somebody on the Liberty Loan Committee of New England, one of the regional Liberty Loan committees, asking if they would participate in the Liberty Loan program. And what happened is Syrian Americans and other Arab Americans nationwide really rallied behind the purchase of Liberty bonds. In fact, in New York alone, the Syrian American community purchased $400,000 worth of Liberty bonds in the early years of World War I. Here we have some of the receipts and some of the information that we got of the purchase of the Liberty bonds. These are from May of 1919, just showing some of the receipts of the members purchasing the Liberty loans. And you can see at the top it says Syrian American Association of Boston, May 1919. In addition to purchasing Liberty bonds, one of the most direct ways that Syrian Americans participated in World War I is through their service in the military. So the Syrian Americans liked to brag that as a whole, about 15,000 Syrian Americans, and when we say Syrian American, we're talking about what today would be present-day Lebanese, Syrian, and some Palestinian Americans. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But really, the Syrian American service, they like to say that 15,000 of them served directly in the armed forces, which at that time was about 7% of the community. So it's a pretty high rate of enlistment for the Syrian American community at that time. What was really interesting about the participation of Syrian Americans in World War I is at the run-up to World War I, any Syrian living in the United States was considered a subject of the Ottoman Empire. If they were born in present-day Syria at that time, was part of the Ottoman Empire, they would have been considered Turkish subjects at birth. So when they immigrated to the United States, they were in a very interesting position of being in the United States, but also participating in a war that was fighting against what would be considered their place of birth. So along those lines, there was a statute in the United States Army at that time, and here we have a letter from the Adjutant General from the War Department saying that anybody who was born in a country at which the United States was now at war and immigrated from that country after the age of 5 could not serve as an officer in the Army. They could still serve in the Army, but they could not become an officer. And this upset some of the Syrian Americans in Boston. They were trying to protest this because they wanted to show that they were loyal to the United States, and that they actually, the majority of the community in the United States was against the Ottoman Empire. To that end, we have a letter here from a young man named George Matuk, who was in the 101st U.S. Engineers, and he wrote a letter, a pretty lengthy letter, to the Syrian American Club of Boston in June 1918, and it just says at the top, somewhere in France. So he was in France writing this letter, and he's basically talking to the community in Boston and explaining to them how they need to stay involved in the war effort because, and he quotes, I quote from the letter where he says, I'm fighting not only for my place of birth, which for him was the United States, but he's fighting for Syria and for liberty. So he saw himself as in France fighting against the Ottoman Empire on behalf of both being an American and being of Syrian ancestry. There were also others, so branching outside of Boston, there were many other Americans of Arab ancestry who served in World War I. Here we have a photo of Sam Hussein Yunus, who served, and much like Other people who were immigrants who served in World War I, many of them were granted U.S. citizenship at the conclusion of their service, and he was one of them. So we had Muslims, we had Christians serving that were of Arab ancestry, and towards the end of the war, efforts not only were about supporting America's fight in the war, but also there was a major famine that was occurring in their home countries. In what was called the Near East, Armenia and Greece and Syria were under tremendous famine, and so the community here in the United States was sending a lot of money back home. Hundreds of thousands of people were suffering and dying in that famine, and so the community wanted to make sure they were helping. So this is a really small part of the items we have, not only about Syrian American participation in World War I, but about Arab Americans in general here at the museum in our archive. And again, we're broadcasting from the Russell J. Abaid Library and Resource Center here in Dearborn. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.